Welcome back to the Grease Goblins Reread channel. Today's video, we're going to be talking about Daenerys 1, or Episode 9, I believe, of the Reread. And today's video is really interesting because to me, Daenerys 1 is, I would say, a more impactful and better chapter than almost her entire storyline in A Clash of Kings, outside of obviously her 4th chapter in the House of the Undying. There's a lot of plot progression, there's a lot of character building, there's a lot of lore, there's just a lot of stuff in this chapter as we have a bit of a recap as to what happened in the last book, but we also are trying to forward the plot. And this is a very long chapter. I think for my notes, this is the longest I've had thus far for this reread. And like I said in previous videos, the open to this book is kind of varied in terms of page count, but especially in this next set of 6, which I usually do where I record 6 episodes in a row and then I'll go back and edit them, you really start to feel that with the last 3, I would say 4 maybe, with this book. But I don't want to waste any more time as this is going to be a long recording session, and if you notice I changed clothes or something, it's because I had to film this in 2 different sessions. So let's dive into page 86 and Daenerys 1. Daenerys stands in the forecastle of the ship Balerion, watching her dragons fly above the sea. The fleet is being towed by galleys whose drums and oars provide a steady rhythm across the water. The sails of Balerion hang limp because there is little to no wind. Despite the slow journey, Dany feels happier than she can ever remember being. The voyage begins in Qarth with the fleet sailing west towards Pentos. So let's just have a little bit of a recap as we're going to explain some of that in this chapter with Daenerys, but just remember, at the end of A Clash of Kings, she runs into Arstan, aka Barristan, and then Strong Belwys, and they are basically sent as protectors for Daenerys from Illyrio. Illyrio wants them to come back to Pentos, so he has sent them a few ships, and so they're supposed to go back. Now this chapter is going to be focused on should they actually do that, and what is the motivations of Illyrio. This is a very important chapter, especially for if we ever get the Winds of Winter and Illyrio specifically. I would even say this is some good foreshadowing to Dance when we finally get back to the character. But there's a lot in this chapter that focuses on what is Daenerys going to do. A lot of A Clash of Kings felt very aimless for Daenerys. You know, her first chapter is just her kind of wandering around the Red Waste. And then Qarth, it's a lot of indecision and begging people and not sure where she needs to go. A Storm of Swords is going to very much change that. George is very much going to take this character in a direction where she's a lot more, I would say, confident, but also decisive in her actions. And we're going to see her conquering. This book largely is very different than the first 2, where Daenerys has more of an active role in her destiny and her life. But Daenerys' Dothraki view the sea with suspicion and fear, calling it the poison water because horses cannot drink from it. When the ships first departed, the Dothraki reacted as though they were being taken to their doom. And remember, the Dothraki don't go on the ocean. They don't go on the water. This is very foreign. They have a lot of things built into their custom to not want to go here. So it just kind of shows how loyal Daenerys' Dothraki are to her. But also this is probably a foundational moment for Dothraki culture of these people accepting going into the ocean. And that's one thing that is definitely going to change with Dothraki culture if we see Daenerys, you know, in Winds of Winter or whatever, like actually get the Dothraki to back her and go to Westeros is that will foundationally break their culture forever. Like, there will never be this custom again where all the Dothraki believe they can't go on the open sea. I think that's a very interesting part of it, is that Daenerys, not only is she going to probably command the Dothraki at some point in the books, she will also fundamentally change their culture. Now, that's not to say that there won't always be, like, parts of the Dothraki that don't agree with what Daenerys is doing, but overall, it's a very interesting idea of how the culture will change because of Daenerys. Dany's young blood riders try to hide their fear from one another, but were visibly nervous as the shoreline disappeared. Her handmaids, Irri and Jiqui, suffered badly from seasickness, and they spent most of the voyage leaning over the rail and vomiting whenever the ships rolled. Now, I want you to think about it from this perspective, because I think this is the best way you could possibly put yourselves in the mind of the Dothraki. Imagine you are the first people to ever go on a boat. Like, let's just say there's never been an invention of a boat before, and somebody comes up to you and goes, hey, get on this boat and we're going to go into the sea. For a long time in history, the sea is what stopped exploration of the rest of the world. And why did North America, for instance, why did it take so long for it to eventually get developed and have some of these other nations come over, especially in Europe? Well, it was because of the sea. It was a dangerous peril. It was a lot harder to navigate. And so you think about that with the Dothraki, it's totally understandable why you would be so seasick and nervous, because in a lot of ways, they view this as death. And can you blame them? Most of Dany's Khalasar remained below decks, the riders preferring to stay near their horses rather than facing the open sea. 6 days into the journey, the fleet encountered a sudden squall. During the storm, Dany could hear frightened horses kicking and screaming below deck, as the Dothraki prayed nervously whenever the ship pitched and swayed. Unlike her followers, Dany feels no fear of storms or the sea. So now add on to the fact that you're already nervous and scared of being on boats. Now there's a terrible storm. These are not the most well-made boats. And when you think about like modern times, like we have boats that are much more prepared for storms. This is not the case. In medieval times, storms would wipe out entire fleets. And we're even going to see with Victarion when he tries to sail to Marine, storms and stuff like that will also scatter his fleet. So storms are a very big problem when you're trying to navigate the open ocean. And so I think that's interesting as well, as not only are these Dothraki having to experience being on the sea for the first time, they're also going through the worst conditions you could possibly have. But again, with Daenerys, obviously she doesn't fear the storms because she's Daenerys Stormborn. She came into this world at Dragonstone to one of the worst storms in Westerosi history, maybe. The storm was powerful enough to tear gargoyles from the castle walls. It also destroyed her father, Aerys II's fleet, smashing the ships apart. Dany views surviving that storm as part of her identity and believes it has made her unafraid of rough weather. In a lot of ways, there's a lot of different interpretations you could have for why George decided to write this. Because in a lot of ways, this storm is the ending of House Targaryen's reign, destroying the fleet. It all but gives Stannis an easy way to get to Dragonstone and to take it. But it also could mean Daenerys coming into the world, the impact she will have on many different cultures and the world as a whole. A lot to say there, especially you could even look at it from Daenerys and all of the trauma she's going to have to go through as a young kid, being in exile and having an abusive brother of who he eventually becomes, and what we've talked about in these opening books. Really, in a lot of ways, Daenerys has had to navigate the storm that was her life. As we get into page 87, Daenerys reflects on how she crossed the narrow sea many times during her childhood exile, constantly moving between the free cities to stay ahead of Robert Baratheon's agents. Unlike the Dothraki who fear the poison water, she's always loved the sea, its salty air, endless horizons, dolphins, flying fish, and the freedom it made her feel. For Daenerys, again, you have to remember one of the key elements to her character, she's never really felt safe. She's never really had a home besides this house with a red door. That's been a key part of her character, is trying to find that safety. And at least on the open sea, she knows at least nobody of like Robert's assassins is trying to kill her. She can feel a bit of that freedom. And I think it's also interesting because you also can look at Daenerys's heritage. The Velaryons, who are known for their navy and their sea power and stuff like that, not in the modern story, but in the past of Targaryen history, it's interesting because, well, the Velaryons married into the Targaryens quite a lot, so maybe it's just a little bit of that Velaryon family blood in her that's talking here, but I don't think it's necessarily that. I think it has more to do with what the open sea and sailing has as a representation for Daenerys. She remembers once telling Viserys that she thought being a sailor sounded exciting. He angrily pulled her hair and reminded her that she was blood of the dragon. Looking back, Daenerys realizes that Viserys was often cruel, foolish, and impatient, though she still misses part of her brother, of who he once was, the boy who had shared stories of Westeros and dreamed of reclaiming their father's throne. And can you blame Daenerys? That's like the last of her family, the person that she's grown up with, and even though he had all these horrible things that he would do to her, she also remembers the good. And I think that's a really nice way of George writing this character, to be realistic. That's how a lot of people that have experienced abuse with family members sometimes will remember family members or whoever. It's, yes, the harm that they did to me and the things that, they've impacted my life, but also sometimes remembering the good that they wish that person might have been. It's more, I think, of a idea of wishing that Viserys had been someone different. And I think for Daenerys, who has felt very isolated really in the last book, it's a nice way to tie that back in there. I think George always does a great way of showing how impactful Viserys was on her life. And another thing I think is kind of funny is the idea that Daenerys is the blood of the dragon, so she can't be a sailor. But like I mentioned, it's funny because House Targaryen married into Velaryons all the time, and this is what they would do. They were sailors, they were adventurers, and so I just found that to kind of be funny. Captain Grolio joins her on deck and jokes that he wishes the ship Balerion could fly like the dragon of the same name. Dany is pleased by his friendliness because he was originally terrified of transporting dragons and insisted on keeping buckets of seawater throughout the ship in case they started fires. At first, the dragons were kept in cages to calm the captain's fears, but Dany soon released them after seeing how miserable they were. Although there's been one small fire aboard, the crew has grown increasingly comfortable with the dragons and even takes pride in them. The sailors enjoy watching them fly above the ship, and Dany enjoys it more than anyone. Dany thinks of Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion as her children, remembering Mirri Maz-Duur's prophecy that she will never bear another child. She believes the dragons may be the only children she will ever have. So, lots to digest here. So, first of all, if I was the captain of a boat, again, dragons are unheard of. They have not been in the world for a long time at this point. And also, they're baby dragons at this point. It's not like they're trained or anything like that as of right now. All it takes is one fairly big accident by the dragons, and there you go. 100 people could die because of the ship sinking because they can't put out the fire. That is a huge problem when you're in the open sea. So I totally understand that. I think the thing just comes down to is like eventually these people are going to get used to the dragons. Once they see them as not being like a huge threat to them, then yeah, of course, they're going to admire the dragon's beauty and these creatures that nobody has seen in their lifetime. That's the amazing part of the dragons. And could you imagine that, right? In a world without the internet, in a world where a lot of the entertainment is built on human connection, socializing, that's something that maybe as a society we've lost over time. Think about that. Think about, you're working on this ship, maybe you're a rower or you're cleaning or whatever you're doing, and your entertainment is you get to watch these dragons. That would be super cool. Just think about the way people react to seeing the dragons on television. I mean, this would be insane. And so obviously these people are going to go, yeah, we are the only ships that have dragons on them. That's got to be a pretty cool and prideful feeling. But then the other part of this is Daenerys, and then we have this reflection of Mirri Maz-Duur, of, oh, Daenerys cannot have children, so these are her children, her dragons. Now, we're going to talk about this later on, very close to the end of this series, because it's alleged, and there is a theory that Daenerys had a miscarriage at the end of A Dance with Dragons. I tend to believe this. I actually never picked up on this until, I would say, since I started this channel, and I heard people bring this up, and I thought, wow, let me go back and read it, and it made a lot of sense. So I don't necessarily believe Mirri, because as a source, she is not the most reliable. She had a lot of reasons to try and put a lot of trauma on Daenerys to try and make her believe she couldn't have a child, because obviously she wouldn't want Daenerys to reproduce. Just makes sense. So again, I don't think Mirri is the most reliable source overall, but we'll just have to see. I also really do like that George is taking time to build Daenerys back up as a character, especially with some of the things from book one, like Mirri and Viserys, and we're going to talk about the House of the Undying. I think a lot of what makes this chapter really impactful, whereas a lot of chapters in A Clash of Kings didn't, is this chapter has just the right amount of foreshadowing as to what's going to happen in the future, lore, so some really cool stuff on the dragons, and kind of, I would say, just generally Essos and its history, while also forwarding the plot. And I think that's something that A Clash of Kings really struggled with. Whereas A Game of Thrones, I thought handled this really well. I think Daenerys is so weird because I think that she's a really great POV, then she's one of the worst POVs, then she comes back to being a pretty good POV, and then she goes to like middle of the pack again. So Daenerys is a very inconsistent POV to me, and I just find that to be very interesting because sometimes it feels like George is excelling with writing this character, and other times it feels like he doesn't have that balance down of everything that's happening in the story. But getting into page 88, Daenerys watches Viserion and Rhaegal flying above the fleet. Viserion's scales are creamed colored with dark gold horns and wing bones, while Rhaegal is green and bronze. The two dragons compete with each other in the sky, constantly trying to gain the higher position. Dany has learned that dragons prefer to attack from above. When one gains the advantage, they often dive at each other and tumble from the sky. And what at first appeared to be deadly combat, she eventually realized it was only play, as they would splash into the sea, separate, and immediately take flight again while steam rose from their scales. Now, this to me is very interesting because as of, the first two books, we hadn't really got much into the dragons. How do they function? What are their behaviors? And I think that's another thing I really appreciate about this chapter is you kind of start to understand where George is going to go with the dragons. You see something like this similar in, say, the Battle of Rook's Rest. A lot of the inspiration for how George was maybe picturing those events in the future with writing Fire and Blood, or even as he talks about some of the histories throughout the main series. This is where probably a lot of that started to come from. And that's one thing I think with A Storm of Swords I've really started to notice on this reread is there is a lot more time I think spent with developing the histories. Like you start to understand where does George pull all of these characters? Where does this stuff starts to form? And I think A Storm of Swords is part of that. I think A Storm of Swords, George started to build out the world a bit more than he did in its history than a Clash of Kings or a Game of Thrones. But with this being said, I also do want to point out, I really like the way George shows the differences of the dragons, like their colors and the way that Daenerys describes them. It feels very different than the show, where the show, it doesn't really feel like the dragons have that. It feels like it's Drogon and then the extras. So I do like that in the book, it's also kind of different in that way. But Dany notes that Drogon is flying somewhere beyond sight, either far ahead of the ships or far behind them hunting. He is noticeably larger, bolder, and more independent than his brothers. He was the first to fly over open water and the first to travel between ships, the first to disappear into clouds, and the first to kill for himself by burning and eating flying fish. Dany notes how quickly Drogon is growing and imagines that within a year or two he may be large enough to ride. For now, however, all three dragons remain relatively small, about the size of small dogs, although lighter because so much of their bodies are wings, necks, and tails. Until they mature, she must rely on ships to carry her across the sea. Again, I really like a lot of this. Building up what are dragons? How do they look in his world? How do they grow? Another thing with Drogon is it's still very unclear as to how is Daenerys able to bond with all three of her dragons. And from an early on, you can see that Drogon is the main dragon. That's not different in the book series. But in terms of Drogon, he seems to have a stronger bond with Daenerys than the other two. And that has led to a lot of questions on, okay, is two other people going to claim her other dragons? Is that why that bond maybe isn't as small? She has a lot of problems controlling the dragons, and she is starting to control Drogon by the end of book 5, but with Rhaegal and Viserion, she hasn't been able to control them really at all. So it is leading up to the idea of okay, is it going to be that even Daenerys is not able to fully bond with all three of her dragons, and it'll have to be two other people? It's an interesting idea that's kind of brought up here with how Drogon seems more confident. Is that because he's bonded stronger to Daenerys, or is it just because it's his personality? We don't necessarily know, but it is something that's interesting to think about given the context of later in the series. Dany notes that the fleet has been trapped in a calm for 6 days and 6 nights, with the 7th day now passing without any wind. While the trading galleys Vhagar and Meraxes can continue moving using their hundreds of oarsmen, the large cog of Balerion is nearly helpless without wind and must be towed, greatly slowing the entire voyage. The ships are heavily laden and crowded with passengers, animals, supplies, and cargo, as the lack of wind has turned what should have been a straightforward voyage into a slow and frustrating journey across the narrow sea. If there had been wind, would Daenerys and her plan eventually with Jorah have actually gone awry? Because if they had actually had wind, they might be on their way to Pentos or whatnot. They might not even have the option of, hey, let's go to Slaver's Bay. That's another interesting thing to think about, how Mother Nature in a lot of ways has maybe helped Daenerys find her own path. Ser Jorah joins Dany on the forecastle and remarks that he cannot see Drogon. Dany replies that Drogon is not the one who is lost. They are. She believes her black dragon has little patience for the slow pace of ships and prefers the freedom of the sky. Curious about her dragon's future, Dany asks Jorah how large dragons can become, and Jorah recalls tales from the Seven Kingdoms of dragons so enormous that they could supposedly snatch giant krakens from the sea, as Dany laughs and says, such a sight would be wondrous to behold. And this is something that George also does in this chapter. He brings up krakens a couple times. Now, I don't know if this is foreshadowing to the future conflict between Daenerys and possibly Euron. It's possible we could eventually see Daenerys and her dragons against Euron, and, well, either the literary idea of the Greyjoys having a kraken on their sigils, or maybe literally, maybe Euron has krakens. We just don't know. Could be foreshadowing to that. But again, I really like this. George is helping us understand what are dragons in this world. How big will Daenerys' dragons ever get to if they're allowed to grow? It's very interesting because all of this stuff, for the most part, has not been answered throughout the first two books of the series. As we get into page 89, Dany asks whether the stories about giant dragons and thousand-year lifespans are true, and she wants to know how long dragons actually live as Viserion flies low over the ship, his wings stirring the motionless sails. Jorah explains that legends claim dragons live far longer than humans, but says the dragons most people know about were the Targaryen dragons, which were bred for war and often died in battle. While dragons are extremely difficult to kill, he notes they are not immortal. Whitebeard joins the conversation and tells Dany that Balerion the Black Dread lived to be around 200 years old during the reign of Jaehaerys I. He says Balerion became so enormous that it could swallow an Arrakis whole, and adds that dragons never stop growing as long as they have sufficient food and freedoms. So this is very interesting because, again, through Fire and Blood, Balerion is really the only dragon we actually see continue to grow and then kind of die of, like, old age, or allegedly. Some people believe maybe Balerion was poisoned or something by the Maesters, if you really want to get into conspiracies. But it is interesting because the Targaryen dragons almost always died in combat or something along those lines. That's really what the dance is about, showing the destruction of House Targaryen's power and the dragons. But I do find it interesting is, okay, well, let's look at Valyria. When Valyria was in the heights of its power, how long did dragons live then? Dragons were much more prominent. There would have been much more studies and histories of dragons and them living full lives without dying to war or something along those lines. It would have been very interesting to understand dragons and their lives. But as of right now, the idea should just be your dragon's going to outlive you by a lot. As long as it doesn't die in combat, it's going to outlive you by a lot. Like, think about that. Balerion, 200 years old. Let's just throw that out there. That's most of the Targaryen reign. Curious about the mention of freedom, Dany asks Whitebeard what he means. He explains that the Targaryens once kept their dragons in the dragon pit atop the hill of Rhaenys in King's Landing. Although the dragon pit was enormous, later generations of dragons raised there never grew as large as the earlier dragons. Whitebeard says the Maesters believe the dragon's smaller size was caused by confinement within the dragon pit's walls and dome. Jorah rejects this idea, arguing that humans do not grow larger or smaller based on whether they live in castles or huts. Whitebeard responds that dragons are fundamentally different from men, but Jorah mocks the answer and challenges what the old man really knows about dragons. And let's be fair, none of these people were alive when dragons were. But I do want to throw this out here, because I've also questioned this explanation from the Maesters quite a lot. Because how does this make sense? If the dragons are being given a ton of food, like they are, or at least that's what we're told, they shouldn't ever stop growing. It doesn't really make sense. I think the explanation more likely is that they might have been getting poisoned in their food supply, something along those lines. I am someone that also believes that the Maesters were somehow poisoning or were altering the dragon eggs to never hatch, because it's kind of very weird that all of this stuff stops happening once Aegon III takes the throne. And then eventually, and I wanted to just add some context here just to refresh myself on this idea, but Aegon III, he was not of age to take over in his full power. So at one point, Grand Maester Munkin was temporarily took on the role of Hand while also being the Grand Maester and Regent. That is a ton of power. And given everything we know, I can't go into full details because we'll be here for hours, but there's a lot of reasons that the maesters might not like the dragons. And so now you put the Grand Maester, and he has all of the power, and all of a sudden the dragons stop hatching. It's a little suspicious, don't you think? Especially when you have Marwyn later on in this series straight up telling us that the dragons died because of the maesters. So I do want to point that out there, that I don't think this is a good explanation, that the dragon pit is the sole reason behind the dragons not growing. If you want to say that it's because of magic, if you want to say that the magic was fading out of the world after the dance, so that was causing dragons not to hatch, that was causing the dragons to grow smaller, I think that makes more sense than just saying, oh, it was because of the dragon pit, they couldn't roam anymore. Doesn't really make sense, because the roaming idea is for them to hunt and to get more food. So if they were being fed, they would still grow. I disagree with that whole concept. But getting back to the chapter, Whitebeard admits his knowledge is limited, but says he once served in King's Landing during the reign of Aerys II Targaryen. While there, he often walked beneath the great dragon skulls displayed in the throne room. Dany says Viserys used to tell her stories about those dragon skulls. She believes Robert Baratheon removed them because he did not bear having symbols of House Targaryen looming over while he himself sat on the Iron Throne. Intrigued by Whitebeard's time in King's Landing, Dany asks whether he ever personally met her father, King Aerys, who died before she was born. So again, I want to talk about this for a second. If you're Robert, you just took down the Targaryen power. Obviously, you don't want the dragon skulls there, because what are the dragon skulls meant to represent? The power of House Targaryen. Defy us, and we'll come kill you, more or less. Now, for Robert, of course, you don't want that. But it's ironic, given the fact that Robert's claim to the throne is, well, yeah, because he has some ties to House Targaryen, as House Baratheon does, but it was just conquest. So it's just ironic that, okay, Robert on one hand uses his blood of being part Targaryen to claim the throne, but then also removes all the Targaryen stuff. So again, just kind of to show you the hypocrisy of Robert's claim to the throne not actually being because of his lineage or whatnot. Also, it'd be super scary. You just took down the people with the dragons, and they're just looming there, these skeletons. Like, I would also probably remove them, even if they looked super cool. Dany then asks Whitebeard whether he knew her father, and Whitebeard confirms that he met him and says Aerys was often pleasant, though he carefully notes that the king could also be harsh towards those he considered enemies. Dany responds that wise men should avoid becoming enemies of kings. And obviously, Barristan is very uncomfortable by this question. If you didn't know, I guess I just spoiled that. But Whitebeard is Barristan, or Arstan is Barristan. And there's a lot of things that are very suspicious here. And Jorah obviously picks up on these things, and Daenerys should be. You had contact with the king regularly? You're also this old, and you're a squire? And then you're also going to know about Jorah's tournament that he won? What's going on here? Because something isn't adding up. But I would say that Barristan is very nice to Aerys. It depends what Aerys you're talking about. Because if you're talking about Aerys before he becomes like the Mad King towards the latter parts of his reign, then yeah, Aerys was somebody that was never really described as mad. He was described as somebody that had a lot of big dreams, that could be very kind, but eventually paranoia and things like that took over. Some people believe Bran had some time travel stuff that made him go mad. I personally hate that theory, because I actually love the way that George depicts Aerys's reign and how he as an individual gets corrupted by that power. I do really like that story, so I hate the idea that Bran had any influence over that, but we'll have to see. But then Dany asks Barristan about Prince Rhaegar. Whitebeard says that many claim no one ever truly knew Rhaegar, though he personally saw him at tournaments and heard him play his silver-stringed harp. Jorah dismisses this as common knowledge, but Whitebeard demonstrates deeper familiarity by naming Rhaegar's squires, Miles Mooton, Richard Lawnmouth, as well as close companions such as Jon Connington and Sir Arthur Dayne. Like, this should all be suspicious. How does Barristan, who is just some random squire guy, have frequent knowledge or understanding of who your father was? How does he know this much stuff about Rhaegar? It's very suspicious. Barristan had to, or I guess I should say Whitebeard or Arstan, had to have been in close proximity to these people to understand this really well, or at least have been at court, right? So that should spark a lot of things in Daenerys' mind as to who is this person. But another thing I really like about what George says is he basically has Barristan describe Rhaegar as no one ever truly knew what he was about. And that, I think, really describes the way even we look at him. We have so many biased accounts of Rhaegar that it's hard to figure out who he truly was. Was he motivated by this prophecy of maybe he discovered Aegon's dream, and that's what made him start doing the things he was doing? It changed his entire life. He was this man that seemed very sad, tragic, but also at the same time, he does a lot of things that cost a lot of people their lives. And also he ran away with Lyanna, or if you believe he sexually assaulted Lyanna, like whatever you want to say there. There's a lot of things here that Rhaegar does, but doesn't really think of like the repercussions of how it affects people. But at this, Daenerys is excited by the name of Arthur Dayne. She recalls Viserys telling her stories of the Sword of the Morning and his famous pale blade, Dawn. Viserys had always claimed that Dayne was the only knight in Westeros who could truly match Rhaegar, which is hilarious because they're going to talk about Rhaegar and his ability as a fighter, but Arthur Dayne was far better than Rhaegar, and that just kind of shows Viserys' bias. And of course, like Rhaegar, I would say, is like an above average fighter who had great training, but he was not one of the top fighters, especially of this generation. He wouldn't even be in the top 10 probably. I mean, think about the people you had, like even the Kingsguard. Like most of the Kingsguard would have beaten Rhaegar, if not all. So I just think that's kind of funny. Whitebeard then carefully avoids directly agreeing with Viserys' assessment, as Dany notes his hesitation and reminds him that Viserys was a king, even if he never sat the Iron Throne. She then points out that Jorah once called Rhaegar the Last Dragon, and argues that such a title must mean he was a peerless warrior. Whitebeard answers respectfully, but offers a more nuanced view. He acknowledges that Rhaegar was a powerful and accomplished fighter, yet questions the idea of any warrior being truly without equal. Drawing on his experience watching countless tournaments and wars, he argues that victory often depends on circumstances as much as skill. According to Whitebeard, even the greatest knights can lose because of something as simple as poor footing, an unfavorable wind, or bad luck. A champion may win one tournament and be defeated in the next. He suggests skill alone does not determine outcomes in battle. Now, I think this is kind of an interesting take because, yes, in an actual war, things can go wrong. You can just get unlucky. And you might even say Rhaegar got a little bit unlucky. But I don't know. I think that Barristan's kind of overselling it a little bit. Like, Barristan is considered maybe the greatest sword fighter in the entire story. I think if you had Arthur Dayne versus Barristan and Arthur doesn't have Dawn and they just both have regular swords, Barristan probably wins. You can argue with me on that, but I think it's also a little bit more of like Barristan just kind of going, kind of downplaying even maybe his own skill, given how he is as a fighter. But he is also right. Like, going into a fight of life or death, you have to not just think about your skill with a blade, you also have to consider what are your strengths versus their weaknesses. What is the landscape that we're fighting in right now? We saw this with Bronn in the first book when he has the first trial of combat for Tyrion. He does this perfectly. He understands the environment. Vardis might have been a better fighter than Bronn, but Bronn used all of his advantages to beat him. That's kind of what Barristan's trying to say here. He finishes by noting that other factors can influence victory as well, casting a meaningful glance towards Jorah and mentioning a lady's favor tied around a knight's arm, a reference that recalls Rhaegar crowning Lyanna Stark the Queen of Love and Beauty at Harrenhal. Yeah, there's some really interesting moments where you think about your emotions as well. You can have that extra motivation to prove yourself or to win. Think about Robert on the Trident. He was super angry because of what Rhaegar had done. He had that extra emotion that might have led him to beat Rhaegar, because Rhaegar does injure Robert. Like, Robert is in a bad condition where he's not even able to lead the assault on King's Landing. That goes to Ned. So it does have that extra emotion there, the love and things like that. But it also points out something about Barristan. Barristan even knows about Jorah in this tournament, which is not something that's like widely known to say just random small folk. It's not like anything like that. So for, again, Barristan to know this information, or Arstan, it should bring up a lot of warning bells. And I think Jorah is picking up on this, obviously, but he has his own ulterior motivations. But that'll get us into page 91. Whitebeard comments about a lady's favors strikes a nerve with Jorah, reminding him of Lanice Hightower at the tourney in Lannisport that Jorah had won both the championship and Lanice's hand while wearing her favor. Their marriage ultimately ruined him financially and ended with her abandoning him, making the subject painful for him. Dany diffuses the tension by assuring Jorah that Whitebeard meant no insult. Jorah reluctantly accepts her judgment, and Dany steers the conversation back to Rhaegar, explaining that everything she knows comes from Viserys, who was only a child when their brother died. She wanted to know what Rhaegar was truly like, and Whitebeard describes him as able, determined, deliberate, dutiful, and single-minded. He then recounts a famous story from Rhaegar's youth. As a child, the prince was intensely bookish, showing little interest in games or martial pursuits. The maesters admired his intelligence, while some knights mocked him as another Baelor the Blessed. According to the story, something Rhaegar discovered while reading dramatically changed the course of his life. One morning he appeared in the training yards and told Sir Willem Darry, the master-at-arms, "I will require sword and armor. It seems I must be a warrior." And from that day forward, he dedicated himself to becoming one. Now, a lot of people point to this as being a very crucial moment in our history and understanding of Robert's Rebellion and Rhaegar as a person, because what did he possibly read that led him to the idea that he needs to become this great warrior of House Targaryen? Now, it could be simply that he understood he needed to be a warrior, not necessarily that he liked it. We even have the same idea with Jaehaerys the First. He was somebody that didn't love to fight or to battle or anything like that, but he knew he needed to be a good warrior so that people would not exactly fear him, but see him as competent. And so maybe it's something like that, but I very much believe that Rhaegar probably stumbled upon Aegon's dream, the idea of possibly the White Walkers, and needing to have a strong Targaryen king that could lead them through it. And so I believe that's likely what happened, and it makes sense, because even after becoming a fighter, he never seemed to take any pleasure or enjoyment from it. And so I think that's why. He saw it as something he needed to do, not something that he liked to do. Dany is delighted by the story, seeing it as confirmation of the heroic image of Rhaegar she always carried. Whitebeard agrees that Rhaegar did indeed become a warrior of great renown before excusing himself to attend Strong Belwas. Now, again, I think this is a very biased point of view for Rhaegar. Rhaegar is not really what Daenerys is picturing. Rhaegar was not this great fighter. He was definitely competent, definitely above average. He was good enough to where he could inflict wounds on Robert, but he was not like, if you were going to do a tier rank of the best fighters at this time, Rhaegar would probably be more like in A or high B tier. He wouldn't be in like your S tier of warriors. Barristan's also leaving out a lot of Rhaegar's flaws, a lot of things that he definitely did wrong, especially his relationship with Elia, running off with this other woman, maybe having a child, the rumors of what had happened there, that causing a war that brought about the downfall of their entire house. There is a flip side of this, and you're kind of seeing with Daenerys where early on especially, she only gets the biased points of view of especially her family. Strong Belwas emerges from below deck demanding food in his usual loud fashion. The massive former pit fighter orders Whitebeard to fetch him a meal, and Dany allows the old squire to leave. But once Whitebeard is gone, Jorah watches him suspiciously. Although Dany has come to trust the old man, Jorah remains wary and advises her to take Whitebeard's stories and opinions with caution. Now, Jorah, to me, is a very fascinating character in this chapter. Not because he's good. I actually hate Jorah, but in terms of being a very good supporting character. That's one thing that Daenerys really lacked in Book 2, is we don't see enough, I think, of Jorah and his relationship, his dynamic with Daenerys in the second book. And there's not a lot of characters to fill in that void. Whereas in Book 3, right away, like we have some very interesting characters around Daenerys, especially the addition of, well, Barristan. We don't know it yet. Well, if you're a very astute reader, you probably would have picked up on, oh, this might actually be Barristan. But it's the side characters that help build Daenerys' character. And with Jorah, one thing we're going to have to talk about a lot in this chapter is Jorah obviously has a lot of ulterior motives. On one hand, yes, he's right about Barristan. He is lying about who he is. He is deceiving Daenerys. But on the other hand, Jorah largely is biased because he lusts after Daenerys. In a lot of ways, he comes off as like this mental abuser slash groomer to Daenerys. He is always trying to dissuade her of anyone around her and trying to isolate her so that she is basically reliant on Jorah. This is classic abusive behavior, and Jorah is by far one of my least favorite characters in the book, and they definitely made him a lot more likable in the show, but he is definitely not that in the book. As we get into page 92, Dany reminds Jorah that a ruler must listen to every kind of person, believing that while a single voice may lie, truth can often be found by hearing many perspectives. Jorah remains unconvinced and warns her that Arsene Whitebeard is not what he claims to be. He finds it suspicious that a man so old, educated, and well-spoken would serve as the squire of someone like Strong Belwas. Now let's just say this, Strong Belwas is a Chad, but he is right. There's nothing here is making sense in terms of who this Ariston character is. It just doesn't add up. On the other side of this, though, I will say this. Daenerys' quote there is very intelligent. You don't just listen to one person and take their opinion or what they're saying as gospel. You need other perspectives. There are other people that have very different lives, very different perspectives of how the world should run or how you should be as a ruler or what you should do. That's very intelligent and important. I really wish in the world we had today, this was more accepted. You know, the idea that everybody isn't the same and everybody shouldn't think the same. That's what makes people unique and interesting, that we all have different ways we walk this earth and live about our lives. Really, I think a banger quote there from George R.R. Martin that he gives Daenerys in this first chapter. Dany privately admits that the relationship between Whitebeard and Belwas seems unusual, as Belwas claims that Magister Illyrio sent him from Pentos to protect her, and Dany knows she needs the protection. King Robert previously offered rewards for her death, and one of those attempts had been with the poisoned wine that had nearly succeeded. But ironic, Jorah is the person that saved her there, but Jorah also is the one putting her in danger. Jorah is also betraying Daenerys. He's lied to her and all this stuff, and that's why it comes off as so hypocritical. Jorah is trying to tell Daenerys that all these people are trying to use her or are going to betray her or whatever, when Jorah has already done that. It's almost like the guilty person calling other people guilty when he's just as guilty. It's very ironic when you view Jorah through that lens of how he is also trying to use Daenerys. As she sails closer to Westeros, Dany reflects on the many potential enemies surrounding her. Pyat Pree already sent a sorrowful man to kill her after the destruction of the House of the Undying. The Dothraki cows who once followed Drogo would likely attack her small Khalasar if given the chance, enslaving her followers and forcing her into the Dosh Khaleen. She is also uncertain whether figures such as Xaro or Quaithe should be considered allies, enemies, or something in between. Dany notes that both Jorah and Whitebeard have already saved her life once each. Jorah from the wine merchant's poison, and Whitebeard from the Manticore's attack in Karth. She hopes Belwas may prove equally useful in the future, though she recognizes that despite his immense strength and fighting ability, he can be surprisingly childlike and unreliable as a bodyguard. Now, Daenerys will come to very much value Belwas throughout this book and in the future, so just a nice little bit of foreshadowing there as well. But it is kind of to show that Daenerys is kind of still dealing with the issues of book 2, where she feels backed into a corner where she has nowhere to turn. So the big decisive moment is going to be, where is Daenerys actually going to go in this book? What is her arc going to be? For the moment, Dany considers her true protectors to be Jorah, her blood riders, and above all, her dragons. She believes that one day the dragons will become her greatest defense, just as dragons had helped secure House Targaryen's power to begin with Aegon the Conqueror. At present, however, they are still small and vulnerable, while simultaneously making her a target because they're the only living dragons in the world and are beyond value. On one hand, the dragons represent Daenerys' future. If she can keep them alive and growing for at least the next few years, then yes, she will be able to do almost exactly what Aegon did before her. But, as of right now, the dragons are, yes, dangerous, but they're not that dangerous in comparison to oh, okay, you have a couple guys try and net the dragons, and now you have something that is worth more than anything on the planet. So, that to me is another thing, is her greatest strengths are also her greatest weaknesses. Even go back to who her guards are. Jorah is her greatest ally, her protector. He's actively betrayed her already and is basically abusing her mentally and locking her into only being reliant on him. Daenerys is going to have to pave her path throughout this story with those things in mind. While considering Jorah's warning, Dany suddenly feels a cool breeze. The stagnant air that has trapped the fleet for 6 days finally breaks as the sails begin to stir. All across Balerion, sailors erupt into cheers shouting that the wind has returned. As we get into page 93. Now this will be the moment where Daenerys has to choose. What will she do in this book? The wind has now come back, and the ship is no longer stalled. Where will Daenerys go? The return of the wind transforms the mood aboard the fleet. The sails of Balerion fill once again, the rigging tightens and hums, sailors cheers from decks and masts. Captain Groleo rushes to issue orders, and even Strong Belwith celebrates. Dany sees it as a sign of the gods' favor and rejoices that their journey west has resumed. In a lot of ways, it is the gods maybe telling Daenerys, this is your chance. Figure out what you're going to do. Jorah is less optimistic, though. When Dany happily says they are finally moving again, he asks what exactly awaits them at the end of the voyage. Throughout the day, the fleet makes good progress as the wind blows from the east, though it becomes stronger and more unpredictable by evening. As the sun sets in a brilliant red sky, Dany reflects that she is still far from Westeros, but growing closer with every passing hour. Now, one thing we don't necessarily know that we're going to have to look at with Illyrio's motivations is what was Illyrio's plan? And obviously, I think there are a bit of plot holes with, again, Illyrio's motivations when you go back to the first book. And I think what the plan would be here is Illyrio wants Daenerys to come back. So at this point, maybe George has in the back of his mind the young Griff plot. There is a bit more foreshadowing to it in this book, especially with the introduction of the Blackfires and their name being dropped for the first time. So I think it's very plausible that he started to figure out, okay, the plan would be that Daenerys comes back, Daenerys eventually marries young Griff, the two with the Golden Company and with the dragons eventually would take Westeros. It does make sense. I think it would take a few years for that to actually happen, but it does make sense. I don't think that Illyrio's plan would be to sell her out or use her dragons in a way that he takes them from her. But we don't know. We don't really necessarily know what was Illyrio's original plan. One thing I would love to talk to George about was how he writ the idea of young Griff and Illyrio. When did he conceptualize that plot line that would happen in Dance? Dany imagines her eventual arrival in the Seven Kingdoms, wondering what it will feel like to finally see the land she believes is hers by right. She pictures Westeros as beautiful and welcoming, unable to imagine it as being otherwise after spending her life dreaming of it. And this is one thing that I think will really be impactful for Daenerys, really, when she ever gets to Westeros, if she does, if we get the next book, is how is she going to be perceived, right? Daenerys is kind of idolizing this dream return to Westeros, that people will love her and things like that, but I think it's going to be actually the opposite. I think most people are going to view her as a foreign conqueror, that they won't be happy that she's come to Westeros, especially after the amount of war that's happened in the country, and especially when it feels like maybe things are returning to peace if young Griff takes the Iron Throne. I think that's really important with statements like this, how Daenerys has dreamed of it, of being this home and this place that eventually she'll find safety in, and I don't think she's going to necessarily find that. Later that night, Dany sits in Captain Groleo's cabin feeding her dragons. Groleo has given up his own quarters to her, declaring that a queen outranks a captain even at sea. Irri and Jiqui continue taking turns sharing Dany's cabin, with Jiqui beside her that night while Irri sleeps nearby. A late night knock reveals Jorah, who apologizes for disturbing her. Dany invites him in and shows off the progress her dragons are making. Holding up a piece of salt pork, she commands Drogon with the Valyrian word Dracarys, as Drogon immediately breathes fire, perfectly cooking the meat in midair before snatching it from the sky. Rhaegal attempts to steal the food from Drogon, but is too slow. After, Drogon swallows the meat and screams in triumph. Dany scolds Rhaegal for being greedy and reminds him that he received the previous piece. Pleased with her growing abilities, she remarks to Jorah that she will no longer need to cook their food over a brazier before feeding them. So again, some just nice writing for the dragons, showing off their growth and all that kind of stuff. And also the formation of her now using the Valyrian word Dracarys to get them to blow fire, all that kind of stuff, which I think is all good. Another thing I should mention here is Jorah abruptly comes to her cabin. Daenerys is naked at this point, and that will become very important as we go on in this chapter, and I thought it was relevant to bring up because this is a very awkward conversation when you really think about it. Jorah coming to Daenerys' room. Daenerys is a young girl. Like, she's not Emilia Clarke in the show. She's completely naked having this conversation. Jorah is not like, oh, get dressed so then we can have a conversation. Nope, he's just, peeping right now. I just want to point that out of how I think twisted and how much I dislike Jorah, especially in this chapter. As we get into page 94, Dany demonstrates that the dragons now recognize the Valyrian command Dracarys. When Jorah repeats the word, all three immediately react, and Viserion breathes a blast of pale gold flame that causes Jorah to step back. Dany explains that Dracarys means dragon fire in High Valyrian, and that she deliberately chose a command unlikely to be spoken accidentally. This is interesting because in the shows, House of the Dragon has gone to say, like, this is what all Targaryens used. That's not necessarily like the case in the book, whereas this seems like something unique to Daenerys. Now, people could have used this in the past. We just don't have necessarily evidence to back that. So this is the thing, again, the show used, and then eventually House of the Dragon did. It's also pretty intelligent from Daenerys. You don't want people randomly saying whatever your command is for the dragons to breathe flame. Jorah then asks for a private conversation. After Dany dismisses Irri and Jiqui, he reveals that he is worried about three things: Strong Belwys, Arstan Whitebeard, and the man who sent them, Illyrio Opatis. And I think these are all genuine concerns to have if you're from Jorah. The problem is Jorah has very conflicting things going on. On one hand, yes, his suspicious nature is right, that all of them have really their own motivations outside of maybe Strong Belwys. He's just on Illyrio's orders. But at the same time, like I've said multiple times throughout this chapter, Jorah is in a lot of ways trying to isolate Daenerys. Jorah reminds Dany of the prophecy she received in Qarth, which foretold that she would be betrayed 3 times, once for blood, once for gold, and once for love. Dany agrees that Mirri Maz Dur was the first betrayal, leaving 2 yet to come. Because of that prophecy, Jorah finds the sudden arrival of Belwys and Whitebeard suspicious. He warns Dany to not forget that powerful men have repeatedly sought her death, and that King Robert once offered lands and titles to anyone who killed her. Again, this is all ironic coming from Jorah, someone that was giving all this information to Robert to begin with. And even one of the assassins that Daenerys even thinks about is funny because Jorah is the one that basically knew that person was going to poison her because of what he had been doing. So it's really interesting because Jorah is manipulating her 1000% here. But he is also truthful, like people are looking to kill her based on her own actions and things like that, but from Jorah, it kind of rings hollow in a lot of ways. But Dany points out that Robert is dead, but Jorah argues that the threat remains. Robert's son, Joffrey, now sits the Iron Throne, and a son may choose to honor his father's promises and grudges. Jorah believes Dany should not assume she is safe simply because Robert is gone. Now, I'll say this. I would not be fearing Robert so much as I would be fearing the threats in Essos, the things that are much closer to you, because right now, the War of the Five Kings is happening. Daenerys is a very low priority. Even if Joffrey was to carry out what Robert had wanted, she's a low priority right now. And so I'd be much more afraid of threats from Qarth or any of these Dothraki or even Illyria. When Dany questions why Belwys and Whitebeard should be viewed as threats, Jorah focuses on Whitebeard in particular. Although the old man carries no sword, Jorah reminds her how effectively he killed the Manticore in Qarth. In Jorah's view, Whitebeard's apparent harmlessness makes him even more dangerous, since a man with such skill could easily have turned that weapon against Dany herself. So let's talk about that for a second. Yes, Barristan 100% is using his age almost as a disguise, appearing that he is not some big threat or anything, but again, as we know, Barristan is this character, and he's lying to her for a very different reason, but Jorah is right to call that out. As we get into page 95, Jorah suggests that Whitebeard and Belwys may have been working with the assassin in Qarth all along, staging the Manticore attack to earn Dany's trust. Dany then laughs at the idea, pointing out that if it was a scheme, it succeeded perfectly because Whitebeard genuinely saved her life. Yeah, this doesn't make any sense. And this is where it goes a step too far, where Jorah is right to distrust them because, well, they're being sent from Illyrio, and Ariston is lying to them. The idea that you're trying to somehow say oh, they were setting up this whole plot to get in Daenerys' council to do what? You're suggesting like they're going to try and kill Daenerys or take her dragons. They could have already done that in Karth. Daenerys would have been killed. Barristan could have tried to sweep in and take her dragons. Like this idea that, oh, you shouldn't trust them now, even though they saved your life, is just kind of a weak argument, in my opinion. It just goes to show that Jorah is trying to pull out anything to manipulate her. Jorah remains unconvinced. He reminds her that they are traveling on Illyrio Mopatis' ships, with Illyrio's captains and crews, and that Belwas and Whitebeard are ultimately Illyrio's men, not hers. Dany counters that Illyrio's helped House Targaryen for years and claims Belwas told her the Magister wept when he learned of Viserys' death. And this is something that Daenerys is still trying to work through. Who does she trust and how? Because if you go back to the beginning of the story, Daenerys is somebody that seemed to see through Illyrio quite a lot. Because now, as time has gone on and Daenerys has persevered through her life, it seems like she's almost forgetting that Illyrio sold her to the Dothraki, even though, again, that was also kind of Viserys, but also that Illyrio was, in a lot of ways, manipulating Viserys, telling him things that weren't actually true, like there were people in Westeros praying for his return. In a lot of ways, back in Book 1, Daenerys saw right through him. But I do think as time has gone on and she's kind of forgotten these things, and now she just kind of sees him as a supporter, she is kind of not realizing that Jorah is right to an extent. Everything that you now possess is not really yours. It's Illyrio's. You need to gain your own loyalty, your own power, not Illyrio's. So how does Daenerys do that? And that's kind of where the ending part of this chapter follows. Jorah questions Illyrio's motives, wondering whether he mourned Viserys himself or the plans he had built around him. He argues that men do not become as wealthy as Illyrio through generosity, and reminds Dany that the warlocks foretold a betrayal for gold, and in his view, Illyrio's immense wealth and ambition make him dangerous. I think this is all fair from Jorah to point out that, like, okay, you've gotten this prophecy. Illyrio, what does he necessarily want from you? And that's the key here, because Daenerys doesn't have the power to take Westeros yet. But given a few years, let's say Dany goes back to his manse and just lets the dragons grow, eventually she will have the power to take Westeros. So maybe Illyrio is playing a long game, or maybe he's trying to do something more sinister. Again, I've speculated at what his real plan was. Daenerys would come back to Illyrio, and then eventually Dany and Young Griff would be married off. They'd become a power couple, and eventually the Golden Company would come into her power. So eventually Daenerys would get that power, but it wouldn't feel like it does now, where she's trying to earn, she's trying to gain her power, an army that's loyal to her. The Golden Company wouldn't necessarily be that. Dany replies that if Illyrio betrays her, she will deal with him just as she dealt with Mirri Maz Duur. But Jorah argues that the situations are completely different. Mirri was powerless at Dany's mercy, whereas once they reach Pentos, Dany will be entering Illyrio's sphere of influence and power. The discussion broadens into an argument over trust. Jorah warns that clever men are often the most dangerous, comparing Illyrio to the wine merchant who nearly poisoned her. Dany responds that she cannot hope to reclaim the Iron Throne without accepting risks and relying on people whose loyalty is not yet proven. And I do agree with both Jorah and Dany. This is a very interesting conversation because, on one hand, Jorah is totally right to question Illyrio's motivations. But, again, there is that bias. But from Daenerys' point of view, what else can she do? She needs to get power somehow, and she can't just rely on people she trusts because there's not very many people she can trust. Even the person in Jorah who's claiming that she should trust him has also betrayed her. So when you look at that, it's Daenerys has to take calculated risks, and that's a lot of what this book is about. Her getting the Unsullied is a calculated risk. Jorah insists that she is placing too much faith in strangers. He points to figures like Pyat Pree and Xaro as examples of seemingly helpful allies whose motives were ultimately self-serving. Dany counters that a ruler who trusts no one is just as foolish as one who trusts everyone. And I totally agree with Daenerys. I think Daenerys is totally right. What was she supposed to do in those situations? And Daenerys never trusted those individuals. She knew that they wanted something from her, but she felt as though she had no other choice. It's not as blind as, oh, trust or not trust. There is this situation where sometimes you're forced into situations. Ned is like a prime example of that. He never fully trusted Littlefinger, but he was forced into a situation where he had to or flee. So I just think that this conversation, Jorah is trying to boil it down to something that it's not really. Jorah then argues that blindly trusting schemers could lead to the same fate as her brothers. Dany grows irritated by his tone as she feels he's treating her like a child rather than a queen and challenges him directly, asking what lies Arstan Whitebeard has actually told her and what evidence exists against either Whitebeard or Belwys. Again, I think this is a good question. If Daenerys is supposed to condemn people, she needs evidence. She can't just go, oh, let me condemn all these people because you think they're lying to me. That's how you lead to a road where you're like Eris. And Jorah really doesn't have much evidence outside of just suspicions, as we get into page 96. But I also think Jorah, when he states that, oh, you're blindly trusting schemers, is just not the case. Like, I do agree with Daenerys. Jorah seems to view Daenerys as almost like incompetent, that she doesn't understand this stuff. Her whole journey in book 1 was a lot about trust, and Miri Mazdur played that trust. And ever since, especially with the stuff she got in the House of the Undying, Daenerys has started to grow a bit more not as trusting. But it doesn't mean that she just is going to ignore everyone else that isn't Jorah. It's a lot more nuanced than that, and I think Jorah knows exactly what he's doing. He's trying to manipulate her. That becomes very, very apparent by the end of the chapter. Jorah continues warning Dany that Arstan Whitebeard is concealing his true identity. He points out that Whitebeard speaks with unusual confidence and knowledge for a mere squire, but Dany defends the old man, noting that she asked for the honest answers and that he knew both Eris and Rhaegar personally. But this should be really suspicious. How many people would have known Rhaegar and Eris to a personal level, had knowledge of these stories on the dragons, and would have also been at this tournament that Jorah actually won? It's just really suspicious. So in that line of thought, Jorah is right. Jorah then reminds Dany that a Kingsguard's duty is not only to fight, but also to advise. Calling himself the first member of her future Queensguard, he asks her to seriously consider a plan that he has devised. Rather than sailing directly to Pentos and placing herself under Illyrio Mopatis' protection, Jorah proposes that Dany first test the loyalty of her new followers by ordering Captain Groleo to change course for Slaver's Bay. This is a very good plan by Jorah, because, for one, you now have resources to maybe get an army, to buy support for Daenerys. And also what kind of puts to the test, is Illyrio putting these people in my hands? Am I in charge of them? Or are these people actually Illyrio's puppets? It is a very good test, and I think Jorah is smart to do that. Dany is immediately uneasy with the suggestion, as everything she's ever heard about the slave cities of Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen has been grim and disturbing. So she asks what possible benefits could be found there. Jorah answers with a single word: an army. He explains that while Meereen's fighting pits could provide warriors like strong Belwys, Astapor offers something far more valuable: the Unsullied, the famous eunuch slave soldiers. And this is a big moment, because for Daenerys, she's stuck between what is the safer option, what is the bold option. Because in my opinion, the safer option is probably to go to Illyrio's manse. But if you're looking at what is the better long-term plan, it is to go get your own power that's loyal to you and not to Illyrio. Dany recalls seeing Unsullied guards in the Free City serving wealthy nobles and magisters. Based on those examples, she is unimpressed, describing them as overweight guards who would not even fight from horseback. Jorah explains that those men are only household guards living comfortable lives. He argues that judging all Unsullied by those examples would be like judging all squires by Arstan Whitebeard. The true Unsullied, he insists, are among the finest infantry soldiers in the world. It's kind of interesting because, like, oh, Barristan, for one, is not a squire, and two, he's one of the greatest swordsmen of all time. It's like, yeah, we can't really compare him to anyone. But again, with Jorah's plan, it makes a ton of sense, specifically with the Unsullied, because they are a loyal army to you. You don't have to worry about if they're going to betray you, if you run out of gold or your situation. They will be loyal to a fault. And one thing I love about this chapter is George gives us more lore into the Unsullied. Why are they so famous? Give us a good example of why Daenerys should even care. And it's a good idea because obviously, us the readers and Daenerys, we have very limited knowledge into the Unsullied, and so that's what George gives us here. But also, it is interesting to know that, like, yeah, if you have an Unsullied and you let him have a very nice life where there isn't much fighting that needs to be done, obviously they're going to eventually maybe get fatter or more comfortable. To illustrate the reputation, Jorah begins recounting the famous story of the 3,000 of Qohor. More than 400 years earlier, during the rise of the Dothraki, Cal Temo led a massive khalasar westward, burning and pillaging as it advanced. Knowing the Dothraki were approaching, the city of Qohor strengthens its defenses, expanded its garrison, and hired the mercenary companies known as the Bright Banners and the Second Sons. As an additional precaution, the city also purchased 3,000 Unsullied from Astapor. And this was almost as like an afterthought, like they were very untested at this point. And boy, did they make a very good decision. As the Unsullied were still marching towards Qohor when they saw signs that the Dothraki had already arrived. Smoke rising into the sky, dust clouds in the distance, and the sounds of battle carrying across the land. Jorah uses this story to again demonstrate why the Unsullied are so feared and respected. So let's continue the story as we get into page 97. Jorah continues the story by saying, once the Unsullied arrived, the city's cavalry had been destroyed, and the mercenary companies hired to defend Qohor had already fled. With the Dothraki camped outside the city and victory seemingly inevitable, everyone expected the city to fall the next day. But at dawn, however, Cal Temo and his warriors found 3,000 Unsullied standing in formation before the gates beneath the banner of the Black Goat of Qohor. Though vastly outnumbered, the Unsullied held their grounds as the Dothraki viewed infantry with contempt and believed they could simply ride them down. The khalasar launched repeated charges against the Unsullied lines, and each time the eunuch soldiers locked shields, lowered spears, and refused to break. Jorah emphasizes that they faced roughly 20,000 mounted warriors and still maintained formation. According to the tale, the Dothraki charged 8 times and were repulsed each time. Temo also unleashed his horse archers, who showered the Unsullied with arrows, but the formation held firm by raising shields overhead and absorbing the attack. By the battle's end, only 600 Unsullied remained, but the Dothraki losses were even worse. More than 12,000 warriors were said to have died, including the Khal, his blood riders, his captains, and all of his sons. After several days, the surviving Dothraki accepted defeat. Their new Khal led the remnants of the khalasar past the Unsullied, and each warrior cut off his braid, the symbol of a Dothraki's victories, and laid it before the surviving defenders as a sign of respect. So this is a very long story. I didn't want to interrupt it, but this is crazy. And it feels very maybe inspired by, again, I know the movie 300 is not historically accurate, but it kind of reminds me of that story where you have, against all odds, these Unsullied somehow stand up against the Dothraki in an open battlefield. Now, it's not the same as like, oh, they were caught in a field. They did have like the city to their back, but it's still an incredible feat and goes to show how dangerous this type of army could be. And it's definitely going to spark Daenerys' interest as well. These are the nice little lore tidbits that I really enjoy, because not only is it just some random world building thing from George, it is very vital to the story at hand. And also, it has a reflection on the Dothraki, as we spent a lot of time with them in book 1, and also the new force that Daenerys will have. So this is one of those times where I know when we get to like book 4 and 5, there's a lot more world building. And I think one thing George does not do well in those 2 books is utilize it into the story like efficiently. It just feels like it's there to world build. Whereas here, it feels very vital to what Jorah is trying to explain to Daenerys. Jorah explains that because of this legendary stand, Qohor thereafter staffed its city guard entirely with Unsullied. Their spears are said to bear braids of human hair in memory of the warriors who honored the 3,000. Having finished the story, Jorah returns to his proposal. He argues that Astapor can provide Dany with this disciplined army she lacks. Rather than arriving in Pentos with only Jorah and her blood riders, she could arrive backed by a force of trained soldiers loyal to her. Dany's immediate concern is cost. She points out that she possesses little wealth of her own and wonders how she could possibly afford thousands of slave soldiers. So there's a lot to unpack here, because in a lot of ways this makes total sense. Daenerys needs an army loyal to her, that she can put her trust in. But at the same time, there's a lot of things that come up here. How do you pay for that kind of an army? We just got through the last book, and Daenerys largely has nothing. The other thing is, okay, if you even get this army, how are you going to get them back to Pentos? Obviously, 3 ships will not be enough, so either you're going to have to buy more ships, which you don't have the money for, or do a land march all the way to Pentos, which would also take a really long time. And so that's the issue you run into. It's a good plan, but it does have some flaws. Jorah reminds her that her dragons still remain an attraction, and that people will maybe put gifts on her just like they did in Karth. But even if they do not, he notes that the fleet's holds are filled with valuable trade goods acquired in Karth. The ships are carrying luxurious merchandise such as silk, tiger skins, jade, and amber carvings, saffron, and myrrh. Jorah argues that these goods could be sold or traded for soldiers, noting that in Slaver's Bay, slaves are relatively inexpensive while exotic imports from the east commands high prices. And this will be what Daenerys will have to decide. Can she do this? Can she use all of this stuff that is not hers at all, right? This is all Illyrio's stuff, and buy this army. It's an interesting idea, and it does make a lot of sense. As we get into page 98, Dany initially objects to Jorah's suggestion of using the cargo because the trade goods belong to Illyrio Mopatis, not to her. But Jorah counters that if Illyrio truly supports the Targaryen cause, he should be willing to contribute those resources towards building her army. If he would not, then his loyalty is no better than that of other wealthy men who offered promises but little else. And this is a great plan, because yes, I think morally, selling somebody else's goods without even their permission, to me, is a little like, okay. But it is a good test to show, okay, if you can sell Illyrio's goods and he's fine with it, as long as you're getting like an army or putting it to good use, then yes, he is a loyal backer. Now, I do think though, like, okay, it's one thing that is he loyal and one thing you're taking from your subjects. So I agree, but I also disagree. But at this, the idea excites Daenerys. She begins to see how an army of Unsullied could transform her prospects. While she acknowledges that an overland journey from Astapor to Pentos would be dangerous, Jorah argues that the sea carries its own risks, including storms, pirates, shipwrecks, and long periods without wind. In his view, neither route is safe, but the rewards of Astapor outweigh the dangers. So I would agree, but I will also say this. Going by sea is far safer than going by land. I mean, think about everything that comes with a land venture. Much slower, you're going to need much more food and supplies to make it over land. Obviously, going on the sea, you also are going to need more ships and food and stuff like that to get you there, but it's significantly faster. And you're more likely to be attacked by, say, Dothraki or mercenaries or whatever on the road than you would be at sea, in my opinion. But I get the point. The idea is, even though the risk might be greater with going on land, you are getting a lot more reward. You're getting an army. Dany then wonders how Captain Groleo, Arson Whitebeard, and Strong Bellis will react if she changes course. Jorah replies that there is only one way to find out. Encouraged by his argument, Dany makes her decision and resolves to order the fleet to sail for Astapor immediately. Energized by the prospect of taking action, Dany leaps from her bunk and begins dressing. She calls for Jorah to hand her clothing and jewelry as she prepares to seek out Captain Groleo and give the order. Now, I want to point out, because this is a very important part of the chapter, Daenerys is not thinking, oh, I'm naked. She's excited by finally having some way to progress, to gain power, to get an army. And she's not thinking about this as like, oh, here's Jorah, this other man in here who's going to see me naked and all this stuff. She even's like, oh yeah, help me get my clothes on, because she's not thinking about it like that. But you see it from Jorah's point of view. Jorah, you think, would go, oh, my queen, cover up or whatever, or something along those lines, because she's a child and he's a much older man. What does he do? He doesn't do that. He doesn't do anything like that. He does possibly one of the most disgusting things and just horrible stuff of this book, and I would say the first three. Instead of obeying, Jorah suddenly embraces her and kisses her. The moment catches Dany completely by surprise. She notices the smell of sweat, salt, and leather on him, the roughness of his beard, and physical force of his embrace. Dany reflects that only Khal Drogo had ever kissed her before. Although she does not immediately pull away, she is unsettled by what is happening and reminds herself that Jorah is her sworn knight and advisor, not her lover. And I think for Daenerys, this is just shock. For one, you haven't been kissed. You haven't had any sexual encounters or anything since Drogo's death. It's just completely catching you off guard. Even if Daenerys doesn't like Jorah, anything like that, and it makes it very abundantly clear being inside of her brain and oh, she might be aroused by this attention or contact, but it's not necessarily for Jorah. It's more the sense of wanting to be wanted or having that intimacy with somebody that she actually likes, and that's hopefully around her age. And Daenerys doesn't do that. She goes for a lot of older men, but yeah, at least in that regard, if she would have gone with Illyrio, she would have had young Griff, who would have been around her age. But A lot of older, weird men like to prey on Daenerys. And this is why I've talked about in this chapter. Jorah obviously is showing signs of being a manipulator, an abuser, isolating Daenerys to then try and get her to basically be his wife or his companion, and even thinking about the fact of, oh, Jorah, you're supposed to be a Kingsguard or Queensguard in this sense. You're not supposed to take a wife, and here you are messing around with the Queen. It's very Kristen Cole, Rhaenyra-esque, and maybe that's what George was going with. There's a lot of parallels to that idea. When the kiss ends, Dany steps back and begins to protest, but Jorah interrupts, declaring that his mistake was not kissing her sooner. He admits that he has wanted her for a long time and openly expresses the romantic feelings he has been harboring throughout their travels together. He states that she was meant to be kissed often, and all the time his eyes were on her breasts. This tells you all you need to know. Why has Jorah actually been backing Daenerys this whole time? And Daenerys has subconsciously known this whole time. Even in her head, she notes that, like, oh, Jorah's looking at her breast, or he's making these weird comments about her. And it just shows you that Jorah is not really loyal to Daenerys in any real sense. He's lusting after her. Even when he's trying to say, oh, I want to kiss you, and declaring his feelings, he's looking at her breasts. Again, Daenerys is extremely young, and this is what Jorah is doing. So, if you didn't hate Jorah before this chapter, you certainly should now. As we get into page 99. After Jorah's kiss, Dany immediately covers herself and insists that what happened was inappropriate because she is his queen. She attempts to reestablish the boundaries of their relationship, but Jorah responds by praising her, calling her the bravest, sweetest, and most beautiful woman he has ever known. When Jorah addresses her as Daenerys, she sharply corrects him and demands that he use her proper title. He reluctantly does so, but continues pressing his feelings rather than backing away. Jorah then shifts the conversation to the prophecy that the dragon has 3 heads, a phrase that has puzzled Dany ever since their experiences in the House of the Undying. He argues that the answer lies in Targaryen history. And before we dive any deeper, I don't want to skip past what Jorah is basically doing. Daenerys is pulling back. Doesn't like what just happened. What is Jorah doing? He's trying to guilt trip her. He's calling her beautiful, smart, all this stuff. Manipulation 101, by the way. How does Daenerys respond? Instead of giving into it, because Daenerys is very strong-willed, she's a very strong character, she's like, no, you can't be doing this. We cannot go from queen to, Queensguard to lovers. It's a weird dynamic, and she's trying to get out of this situation, but Jorah is not letting her, because now Jorah is going to bring up, the 3 heads of the dragon, and he's going to somehow place himself in this prophecy. If you haven't hated him yet, I don't know how you don't. As an example, he points to Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters, Rhaenys and Visenya. Together they rode the 3 dragons, Balerion, Meraxes, and Vhagar, forming the original 3-headed dragon of House Targaryen. Dany responds that such a comparison cannot apply to her because of her brothers, Viserys and Rhaegar, are dead. Without them, there can be no 3 dragon riders in the same way there once was. But Jorah continues by reminding her that Rhaenys and Visenya were not only Aegon's sisters, but also his wives. He argues that the prophecy does not require brothers and suggests that Dany could instead find husbands to fill those roles. The conversation reveals that Jorah's kiss was not a momentary lapse of judgment. He has clearly been thinking about a future in which he stands beside Daenerys, not only as her advisor and protector, but as her husband and one of the riders of her dragons. Jorah ends by declaring that no man in the world could ever be more loyal to her than he would. Think about that for a second. Jorah has sold out all of her secrets, and he's saying this stuff. God, I can't say the specific word I want to say about Jorah, but awful person. He is a predator, 1000%. He's trying to mentally manipulate and I would say abuse Daenerys, trying to force her into this corner to be only reliant on him. And somehow Jorah has come to the rationalization that, the 3 heads of the dragon can just mean, any husband. Don't worry, Daenerys, just go take another husband and you'll be fine. I'll be one of the heads of the dragon. What are you smoking, Jorah? And so that ends out Daenerys' first chapter, and I think it's a very good one. There's really good character building for Daenerys and Jorah, and even Barristan in this chapter. There's great plot progression, trying to focus where is Daenerys going to go. I just think the chapter does a much better job than most of Daenerys' chapters in A Clash of Kings. Whereas in A Clash of Kings, they feel very unfocused, not a whole lot going on, very weak character work for pretty much everyone involved outside of maybe Daenerys at times. It's just a very strong chapter. There's a lot of lore in here and world building that's fantastic that helps us understand dragons, the Unsullied, stuff along those lines. Really enjoyable chapter, just really long, as you guys could probably tell from having to record this in 2 different recording sessions. But I did really, really enjoy this one. And so I'll see you guys all in the next episode. Thank you guys for watching. Bye, guys.